It was several years ago, but I remember that night like it was yesterday. Back then, I was working at a local retail store in a small town. You know, the kind of place, one of those 24-hour stores where you could just get about anything you needed. Since it was the only store of its kind in town, it was opened all night, and every once in a while, I get stuck on an overnight shift. I didn't mind it really. It was always slow, hardly anyone came in, and the work was light. Plus, Steve, the night manager, was laid back and didn't care much about what we did, as long as the place was clean. On that particular night, I was up front stocking some new magazines that had come in earlier that day. I figured Steve was in the back, maybe dozing off like he does sometimes during these late hours. The front door was just out of sight, but whenever someone came in, a bell would chime. It had been quiet for a few hours, and I was almost done with the magazines when I heard that familiar ding from the front door. I put down the stack of magazines I was holding and stepped over a few feet to see who it was. The door was slowly closing, but I didn't see anyone. I thought it was weird. I walked towards the door, peeking down each aisle as I passed by. After a few aisles, I finally spotted someone, a man in a brown leather jacket, jeans, and his back turned to me. It was a small town, and I thought I knew everyone who came through those doors, but I didn't recognize this guy. Not wanting to be weird, I went back to stocking the magazines, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing back towards the front, waiting for him to come closer so I can get a better look, maybe figure out who he was. But minutes passed, and I realized I hadn't heard a sound from him. No footsteps, no rustling through the aisles, nothing. The store was dead silent. I turned around and walked back towards the front, intending to greet the guy, ask if he needed help finding anything. But as soon as I moved up the aisle, he was nowhere to be found. Did he leave already? No way. I would have heard the door chime again. I started checking the aisles one by one, thinking maybe he was at the far end of the store. But by the time I reached the last aisle, the guy had just vanished. I was standing there, scratching my head, when I suddenly got that gut-wrenching feeling, like someone was watching me. I slowly turned around, and there he was. The man stood halfway down the aisle, staring at me. I yelped in surprise, my heart jumping into my throat. I did sort of a nervous laugh and told him he scared me, but he just stood there, staring at me. Now that I could see his face, I was sure I'd never seen him before. There was something off about him, his expression. His face was twisted into this unsettling look, like he was half smiling, but with dead eyes. I asked him if I could help him find anything. He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just kept staring at me with that creepy expression. I started feeling a mix of irritation and unease. I asked him again, a bit more forcefully, if he needed any help. But still, nothing. Just that unsettling gaze. Finally, I told him if he didn't need anything, he should leave or I'd have to get my manager. We stood there for a few more seconds before he finally turned and walked towards the front door. I heard the bell chime as he left, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I went back to the front to make sure he was really gone, but the guy was nowhere to be seen. The whole thing was bizarre, but I shrugged it off, deciding to finish stocking the magazines. About half an hour later, I was at the register getting hungry, so I grabbed my lunch from under the counter. As I started eating, I heard something behind me. I turned around and dropped my sandwich on the ground. The man was back, but this time he was outside the store, standing right up against the glass wall, his face pressed against it. That creepy half grin was still on his face, but now his eyes were wild, crazed. He slammed his head against the glass, hard. I screamed and bolted towards the back office. As I ran down the aisle, I nearly collided with Steve, who had come out to see what was going on. I could barely get the words out. Crazy man, at the window, pointing towards the front. Steve didn't waste a second. He moved quickly towards the center aisle where he could see the front door. I followed close behind him, my heart pounding. Then, the familiar sound of the doorbell went off. When we reached the front, we both saw him. The man was standing just inside the door now, his face smeared with blood from slamming it into the glass. Then, out of nowhere, he screamed and started running towards us. Steve grabbed my arm and we quickly sprinted towards the back office. We ran inside and Steve locked the door behind him. We barely made it inside before we heard a loud crash against the door. Steve grabbed the phone to call the police. I stood there, staring at the door, expecting the man to come barreling through at any moment. A shadow fell across the bottom of the door, and I knew the man was just standing outside. A second later, another loud bang echoed through the small office. I didn't need to see the man to know what he was doing. He was slamming his head against the door now, just like he had against the glass. Minutes dragged on, feeling like hours, until finally we heard the sirens. The cops must have arrived, because the banging stopped and I could hear them yelling at the man outside. It sounded like they got him into custody without much of a struggle. When the police came to get us, we explained everything that happened. They didn't say much, but I could tell by the look on their faces that this wasn't their first run-in with something like that. Probably messed up on drugs, or maybe something worse. All I know is that night changed something in me. I never worked another night shift again. When I was still in high school, I worked at a shoe store in the mall. We had some weird people come through, even some strange employees. The store was small, staffed by a group of about 4 managers and a dozen part-time employees, mostly high school and college kids like me. We were all friendly, but I never really hung out with any of them outside of work. We had one female coworker, Maddie, who kept to herself. She was quiet, a bit nerdy, and mostly stuck to running the register, her nose often buried in a book. One evening, I came in for my shift, headed to the back room where we had a small break area with lockers. It was a simple setup, lockers like the ones at school, where you could put a lock on if you wanted. I never bothered. There was no point really, with only a few of us working at the same time. I also never brought anything of value. After stashing my stuff in the locker, I clocked in and walked out to the floor to start my shift. That night, it was just the manager Ken, Maddie, Jeff, and me. Ken was in the storage area doing inventory, Maddie was at the register as usual, and Jeff, who I knew from school, was cleaning some displays. We chatted as we worked, helping the occasional customer, and going about our business. As the night went on, it got closer to closing time. Ken finally emerged from the storage room, getting things ready to lock up. He gave Jeff and me some closing tasks, and not long after, it was time to shut down for the night. As I headed to the back room to clock out, I nearly collided with Maddie as she was leaving. I apologized, and she gave me a quick half smile and hurried past. When I opened my locker, something caught my eye. A letter that hadn't been there when I first came in. It was folded neatly with, "Your secret admirer," written on the outside. Confused, I opened it, finding a love poem. Jeff, who had followed me into the break room, saw the look on my face and asked what was up. When I told him about the note, he burst out laughing. He said it was clearly Maddie. Who else would have been able to get back here and leave it? I glanced at the note again. The handwriting did seem like it came from a girl, and it was definitely addressed to me, but I didn't have a clue how anyone else could have snuck back here. The thought of Maddie liking me like that was awkward. I liked her, but not in that way, and I didn't want to hurt her feelings, so I decided to ignore it and pretend like it never happened. A few days later, I had another shift. When I arrived, everything was normal. Clock in, put my stuff away, head to the floor. Maddie was at the register, reading again. Ken was once again in the storage room. I'd almost forgotten about the letter until I saw Maddie. I felt a bit awkward, but she seemed completely unbothered, just giving me a quick smile and going back to her book. That night, the store was busier than usual, keeping me occupied with customers until closing. When Ken finally came out to lock the door, I noticed Maddie quickly grab her things and head to the back. I finished up and followed her to the break room, only to nearly run into her again as she was leaving. She mumbled an apology and rushed out. My locker was slightly ajar, and my heart sank when I saw another letter inside. I opened it, and this time, a photograph slipped out. I nearly dropped the picture from horror as I recognized myself in the picture, asleep in my own bed. The note read, "You look so handsome when you're sleeping." My stomach churned with a mix of disgust and fear. This had gone way beyond a harmless crush. I grabbed my stuff and bolted out of the store, determined to catch Maddie before she left. I spotted her unlocking her car and ran up to her, anger and fear boiling over. I shouted at her, telling her what made her think this was okay. She turned to me, looking confused but said nothing. I threw the photo at her, trembling with rage. I told her that if I ever caught her near my house again, I'd call the police. She looked down at the photo, the same puzzled expression on her face. She didn't say a word, just stared at it. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed off to my car, drove home, and spent the night trying to shake off the violation that I felt. The next evening, I went back to work, determined to talk to Ken about what happened. When I arrived, I was relieved to see Shane at the register instead of Maddie. He was covering for her since she called in sick. After putting my stuff away and clocking in, I decided to find Ken and tell him everything. I found him in the storage room, sitting at the desk. As I approached, I saw he was writing something. I froze when I saw the stationery, the same kind used for the letters in my locker. My heart pounded as I looked closer. He was writing another note, and beside it was another photo of me, this time shirtless, playing basketball in my driveway. Ken turned around, startled to see me standing there. We locked eyes, and a twisted, guilty expression crossed his face. Before he could say a word, I turned and ran, the horror of the situation sinking in. Ken shouted after me, saying he could explain everything, but I didn't care. I sprinted out of the store and called the police. They never arrested Ken, but he was fired. Not that it mattered to me. I never set foot in that store again. A few days later, I went to Maddie's house to apologize for accusing her. She accepted it, but we never spoke again after that. It was then that I learned a hard lesson. You really never know who the bad people are in this world. I had been working at a hardware store for a couple of years by the time this event happened. It was a busy place, the kind where you get all sorts of people coming in, especially on the weekends. We'd see our fair share of odd customers, people who would rant about government conspiracies or others who seemed to be barely holding it together. But there was one evening, one customer, that stood out above the rest. I was working in the hardware department, down the aisle with all the chains. You'd be surprised how many different types of chains there are, each one for a specific purpose, and we sold them by the foot. That meant if a customer wanted some, they needed an associate like me to measure and cut it for them. And that's how it all started. A man was standing there, staring at the different chains, not really moving, just staring. I approached him like I would any other customer. I asked him if he needed any help with the chains. He didn't respond right away. He just kept looking, his eyes flicking from one chain to another. I noticed his hands were shaking slightly, and his eyes seemed off, like he wasn't all there. I wondered if maybe he was drunk or on something. I asked again if there was something I could help him with. This time, he looked at me. He had this nervous energy about him, twitchy and anxious. When he finally spoke, he said he needed the strongest chain we had. I told him sure thing. It was a common enough request, so I didn't think much about it at first. But then I asked, more out of habit than anything, what are you using it for? That's when he laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed down the aisle. If I told you, he said, his eyes locking onto mine, I'd have to kill you. He kept laughing, as if he had just told the funniest joke in the world. I gave him a forced smile, the kind you give when you're not really in on a joke, and pointed to a thick, heavy chain. I told him that was probably the strongest chain we carried. Perfect, he said, all traces of humor gone from his voice. I'll take 20 feet. I cut the chain for him, the clinking sound of the metal filling the uncomfortable silence between us. When I handed it to him, he nodded once and turned to leave. As he walked away, I couldn't help but glance into his cart. What I saw made my stomach twist. At least 10 gallons of bleach, a large box of garbage bags, a hacksaw, and various other hand tools. I told myself it had to be a joke. No one would be that obvious if they were planning something sinister. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. The way he acted, the things he said. It didn't sit right with me. I followed him out of the aisle, keeping my distance. He was headed towards the gardening section, and I watched as he picked out a large shovel. That was it. I couldn't just let this go. I found my manager up front, a guy named Steve who had been around for years. I told him about the customer, what he said, and what was in his cart. Steve looked at me like I was overreacting, but then his gaze shifted behind me, and his expression changed. I turned to see the customer checking out at the register. I told you, I whispered. Steve didn't say anything. We both watched as the guy paid for his stuff and headed out of the store. But instead of getting into his car, he walked around to the trunk. I could see him looking around the parking lot, as if making sure no one was watching. Then he leaned over the trunk, his face almost touching it, and I swear he was talking to it. Neither of us could hear what he was saying, but it didn't matter. Steve pulled out a notepad and jotted down the guy's license plate number. As soon as the car was out of sight, Steve ran to the office and called the police. It turns out, my gut feeling was right. The police traced the car to a man who had kidnapped a girl from a nearby college. She was in the trunk the entire time. They found her alive, just hours later. If Steve hadn't taken that guy seriously, and if we hadn't called the cops, I don't even want to think about what would have happened. I'm just glad we did something. That night changed me. Made me realize how close you can get to the edge without even knowing it. Now, every time I help a customer, I can't help but wonder what they're really up to.